The dawn broke pale and brittle over Dry Creek, the frost a thin crust on every roof, every fence rail. Elias McGraw rode in from the north pasture, his breath rising in plumes, the reins creaking in his gloved hands. The town was quiet in that way it always was before the mercantile's door swung open and the day's noise began. He had planned to pick up Seed, maybe linger for coffee before riding back. But the sight in the alley stopped him cold. A woman was crouched there, her coat pulled wide around a small bundle at her feet. She bent her head low, her breath fogging the air above the child's hair. Her hands, bare against the cold, smoothed the blanket with a tenderness that made his chest ache. She didn't notice him at first, too busy murmuring to coax the little girl awake. When she did, her gaze met his with a quick, braced look of someone used to fending off questions. "You'll freeze out here," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "We're fine," she answered, though her lips were pale and her fingers stiff. The child stirred, a dark-eyed girl with hair tangled from sleep. She blinked at him, then pressed closer to her mother's side. Elias stepped down from his horse, the snow crunching beneath his boots. "Come on. The boarding house is serving breakfast. Warm food. Fire." Her eyes flickered, hunger warring with pride. "We can't pay." "Didn't ask you to," he said simply. She hesitated, then let the girl stand. "Annie," she said softly, and the child's small hand curled into hers. The name lodged itself in Elias's mind like a pebble in his boot, small but impossible to ignore. Inside the boarding house, the warmth hit them in a wave, smelling of coffee and frying bread. Martha Kincaid looked up from behind the counter, her eyes narrowing in a quick sweep from Elias to the woman and child. She gave a tight smile. "Sit where you like." But her tone carried the sort of politeness that drew lines rather than erased them. They chose a table near the stove. Elias watched from the next table over, his own coffee cooling as he took in the way the woman kept her coat wrapped close, as if even the heat might be stolen. Annie's eyes darted around the room, taking in every face, every gesture. A few townsfolk gave quick glances, whispers rolling low. One man near the window leaned toward his companion. Strangers. Passing through, no doubt, he murmured. Elias's jaw tightened. When the plates came, thick slices of bread, a smear of butter, and a strip of bacon each, the woman murmured a thank you without looking up. Annie ate slowly, careful bites as though making the food last. Elias sipped his coffee, then leaned toward her table. "Name's Elias McGraw." She paused and met his eyes. "Rosalind Carter." Her voice was steady, but it carried the rough edge of a long journey. He nodded toward the girl. "Your daughter?" "Annie," Rosalind said again, her hand brushing the child's hair. "Just us now." The door banged open, letting in a rush of cold air and a burst of young laughter. Sadie came bounding in, cheeks flushed from the walk from school, her braids swinging. She spotted Elias, rushed to him, wrapping her arms around his middle. "Pa, you came to town without me?" she teased. Elias smiled faintly, smoothing her hair. Sadie's attention snagged on Annie, curiosity bright in her eyes. She stepped closer, grinning. "Hi." Annie's gaze flicked to Rosalind, who gave the smallest nod. "Hello." And he whispered. Sadie glanced back at her father. "She's my age." "Near enough," Elias said. Sadie studied Annie for another moment, then returned to her father's side, but her glances kept drifting back. When the meal was done, Elias rose. Outside, the wind had picked up, sharp enough to cut through a coat. He saw Rosalind adjusting Annie's scarf, readying for the cold again. "Let me walk you to the livery," he offered. "You don't need to," she said, but without the same firmness as before. "Doesn't matter if I need to," he replied. "Just good sense to keep the wind off her." She relented, and they stepped into the brittle air together. Annie walked between them, her boots crunching on the hard ground. The sky was pale and stretched, a cold coin above the rooftops. At the livery, Rosalind turned to him. "Thank you for breakfast." He tipped his hat. "Safe day to you." As they walked away, Sadie tugged at his coat sleeve, her voice low. "She looks like she needs a home," she said, glancing toward Rosalind and Annie looks like she needs a sister. Elias watched their retreating figures, the wind lifting strands of Rosalind's hair. Annie's small hand tucked in hers. The words settled in his chest, heavier than the cold. The wind carried the bite of oncoming winter, sweeping through Dry Creek with a restless whisper. Elias McGraw tightened his scarf and guided his horse down Main Street, the leather reins cold against his palms. Days had passed since that morning at the boarding house, yet Rosalind Carter's face still lingered in his thoughts. The guard eyes, the way her hand never left her daughter's shoulder. He told himself it was Sadie's comment that planted the thought, but the truth was more complicated. He saw her often now, at the pump well, hauling water in a dented pail, her knuckles red from the cold, outside the church, where she stood just close enough to the open door to catch the heat spilling from inside. Always Annie at her side, the girl's fingers looped through her mother's as if she feared she might vanish. Elias offered a nod each time, sometimes a word, never lingering long enough to turn courtesy into charity. One afternoon, he found her in the alley beside the laundress's shop, crouched beside a wagon with one-wheel listing. "Axle pins near gone," he said, kneeling to see. "I know," she replied, her breath mist in the air. "The owner lets me use it for work, but I reckon it's had more years than it should." He fetched a pin from his saddlebag and set to work. The wood groaned under his grip, the metal biting cold into his fingers. Rosalind watched in silence, her coat pulled tight, the hem brushing the dust. When he finished, he dusted off his hands. "I'll pay you back," she said. "Not necessary." Her gaze was steady. "It is to me." She reached into her basket and drew out a small loaf of bread, its crust golden despite the chill. "Payment." He hesitated. The bread was more than a meal. It was a gift from someone who had little to spare. He took it, careful not to brush her fingers more than he had to. By the week's end, talk began to coil through the town like smoke. Sheriff Curtis Hale stopped Elias outside the Mercantile. "Rosalind's been staying near the edge of town," he said, his voice low. "Winter's coming hard this year. Town can't do much more than a cot and soup for folks passing through." Elias kept his tone even. "Maybe she's not passing through." Hale's eyes narrowed. "Careful, McGraw. People talk." That night, Elias sat by the fire, watching Sadie brush her hair. She was humming to herself, eyes bright. "Pa," she said suddenly, "if Annie was here, I'd never be lonely." She said it without guile, then set the brush aside and curled up in her chair. The thought followed him into morning. The frost lay thick on the fence posts as he rode into town, the sun barely clearing the rooftops. He spotted Rosalind and Annie walking toward the pump well, Annie's scarf askew, her small boots leaving shallow marks in frost. The wind nipped at their cheeks, turning them pink. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen dirt. Rosalind looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Cold morning," he said. "Colder than most," she replied, adjusting Annie's scarf. He watched the child for a moment, then met Rosalind's gaze. "Your daughter needs a home." Her hand stilled on the scarf. "We'll manage." "My daughter want a mother," he continued. "The words carry more weight than he'd intended, and I think we might help each other." Silence stretched between them, the wind tugging at the loose strands of her hair. Annie pressed close to her mother's side, looking up at Elias with wide, unblinking eyes. Rosalind's jaw tightened. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he said quietly. "I know you've kept her fed when it couldn't have been easy. I know you stand your ground when this town looks the other way. And I know what it's like to lose someone and keep going, because there's no other choice." Her breath caught, though whether from the cold or his words, he couldn't tell. "You'd taken a stranger? Just like that?" "Not just like that," he said. "Because Sadie's been asking about you both every day since we met. Because I've been thinking about it every night. Because it makes sense." Rosalind looked past him, toward the church steeple, the distant hills beyond it. "And if I said yes, the town would still talk." "They'll talk either way," Elias answered. "Better they talk while you're warm and fed." She glanced down at Annie, who was tracing patterns in the frost with her boot. "We'd be beholden to you." Elias shook his head. "We'd be beholden to each other." A wagon rattled past on the main road, the driver lifting a hand in greeting before disappearing in the cloud of his own breath. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the town's chimneys. Rosalind straightened, the bread basket on her arm swinging lightly. "I need time." Elias tipped his hat. "Take it." As he mounted up, he caught Sadie's words from that morning echoing in his mind. He'd made his offer plain. Whether she took it or not, the balance of his days already felt different, like the first hint of thaw before spring shows itself. He rode away, but when he glanced back, Rosalind was still standing there, Annie's small hand locked in hers, watching him until he turned the corner out of sight. Snow came early to Dry Creek, soft and relentless, laying a pale hush over every rooftop and rail. The cold settled deep, the kind that stiffened breath and made footsteps sound sharp against the stillness. Elias McGraw rode to the drifted streets, his coat heavy with frost, the wind pinching his cheeks. A week had passed since he'd spoken his offer, and in that week, each day felt longer for the waiting. He found Rosalind at the edge of town near the blacksmith's shed. Annie curled close at her side, coughing into her scarf. Her eyes lifted to meet his, a flicker of surprise passing quickly into wariness. "Cold day for errands," he said, swinging down from his horse. "It's a cold day for everything," she replied, pulling the scarf tighter around Annie. Without asking, he unfastened his own coat and wrapped it around the child, the wool hanging heavy on her small frame. Annie's cough eased, her wide eyes peeking over the collar. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the road. "Let me take you to the ranch." "Just for supper?" Rosalind hesitated, the snow settling in her hair like pale ash. Then Annie looked up at her, and something in the child's expression seemed to answer for her. She nodded once. The ride was quiet but not strained. The snow creaked under the horse's hooves, flakes spinning through the air in lazy, endless patterns. Elias caught glimpses of Rosalind's face in the pale light. Her cheeks flushed from the cold, her lips pressed together in thought. Annie sat between them, small hands gripping the saddle horn. When they reached the ranch, the windows glowed warm against the snowy fields. Sadie was waiting on the porch, her braids loose, her face lit by a grin that could have warmed the night itself. She ushered them inside, chattering about the stew on the stove and the bread cooling by the hearth. The kitchen was thick with the smell of thyme and wood smoke. Rosalind guided Annie to the table, her eyes sweeping the room as if memorizing each corner. Sadie placed a bowl in front of Annie, then one before Rosalind, her voice softening as she said, "It's better with honey on the bread." They ate without rush, the only sounds a clink of spoons and the occasional low crack of the fire. Elias watched how Rosalind's shoulders began to ease, how Annie's eyes grew heavy but content. When the meal was done, the girls drifted toward the hearth, curling together under a quilt, Sadie reading in a whisper while Annie listened. Elias poured coffee for Rosalind and himself, the mugs warm against his hands. "I meant what I said," he told her, the words low but steady. She kept her eyes on the steam rising from her cup. "It's not a simple thing, saying yes to something like that. I've had to live my life in a way where I owe no one more than I can repay. I'm not looking to put you in debt," he said. "I'm looking to keep my daughter from growing up lonely, and maybe keep yours from growing up cold." Her eyes lifted to his then, and for a heartbeat, neither looked away. "It's not just the cold, Elias. It's the way the world looks at a woman who takes what's offered. They'll say I came for your land. They'll say I set my sights on you before I even stepped foot in Dry Creek. They'll say what they please," he replied, "but I'll know the truth, and so will you." The fire shifted, throwing light across her face, catching a faint glint of moisture in her eyes before she blinked it away. "And if I'm not the wife you deserve, then we'll have done the best we could for the girls, and that's more than most manage." She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I don't know if I can promise more than that right now." "That's enough," he said. Snow ticked softly against the window panes. Annie's breathing had fallen into the slow rhythm of sleep, her head resting against Sadie's shoulder. The two girls looked like they'd been that way for years, not minutes. Rosalind's gaze lingered on them, something in her expression loosening at the sight. She set her mug down and rose. Crossing the room, she knelt beside the hearth and eased her hand into Sadie's, curling her fingers around it with care, as though sealing something unspoken. Annie stirred, curling tighter against Sadie, their small hands now tangled together. Elias stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching toward the firelight, a quiet satisfaction settling into his bones. Outside, snow kept falling, but inside the warmth held. Rosalind glanced over her shoulder at him, her voice barely above the crackle of the logs. "I'll stay." Elias's answer was a simple nod, the weight in his chest lifting. Somewhere deep in the night, the wind would shift, the snow would ease, and the world beyond this house would start its whispers. But for now, the silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was a pause before something beginning.